Trotsky was keen to use this parallel, and he would say that a Plutarch of the Soviet Revolution would hardly have found two other figures that would better illustrate each other with the contrast of their characters than Stalin and Rakovsky.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello, my name is Yannis Panagiotis, and I'm the Scientific Director of RIZET at the University of Vienna. Today's episode of the Transformative Podcast will be a throwback to our last Transformative Salon. On the 3rd of October, we hosted Maria Todorova for a deep historical perspective on left-wing activism. In this talk, Professor Todorova built on her book Imagining Utopia, The Lost World of Socialists at Europe Margins, that came out with Bloomsbury Academic in 2022, as well as on her current research on the life and times of Bulgarian-born socialist revolutionary Christian Rakovsky. We are thrilled to include this lecture in our podcast series.
First of all, my book was an emancipatory project. All my life I've been writing emancipatory projects, right? My goal was to recuperate the appeal of socialist ideology and the utopia implicit in it, because everybody speaks about the end of utopia. I am doing this by going back to the experience of people who dreamt of utopia and struggled to achieve it. Using different scales of observation, I shifted the focus from aerial views of the large-scale movements of ideas to close pictures of group characteristics, and finally to close-up of individuals. So they are these three levels. Chronologically, I restricted my narrative roughly to the half-century of what Kolakowski termed the golden age of social democracy from the 1870s to the 1920s. I ended with the aftermath of the October Revolution, not because, and I want to insist on that, not because I wanted to gloss over, let alone smear the interwar period of communism by insisting that it had an earlier and nobler, less militant prehistory. I do think, however, that there is a qualitative difference between a utopia of the future and a utopia on Earth. And that has to do with the effects of generational shift. These were different people, encompassing everything from approximate demographic clusters to specific social habitus, to the consequences of singular dramatic events serving as a rupture, like the Great War or the October Revolution itself. For its followers, it had actualized their utopia. The future was no longer desirable and nebulous. It had just arrived and had to be defended. The book, in fact, is crafted along these different scales. The first part, Center and Peripheries, looks at the history of social democracy from the posited margins of Europe. I addressed the paradox of socialism in agrarian societies and challenged the established typology of two modes of socialism, Western or European, and Eastern or Russian or Soviet. This could be, allegedly, but not necessarily applicable only after the 1920s with the creation of the Third International, the Comintern. The passionate debates within the Second International were not placed on a West-East axis. Part 2, Generations, addresses the interplay of several generations of leftists, not only Marxists, but leftists in general, looking at the specifics of how socialist ideas were generated, received, transferred, and transformed. I offer then three ways of approaching groups: a quantitative, prosopographical analysis of over 3,500 individuals, a qualitative account of the different experiences of becoming socialist, and finally, I try to shed light on the invisible women in this movement by questioning the opposition between socialist women and socialist wives. My last part, Structures of Feeling, focuses the lens on individual experience. It investigates the intersection between subjectivity and memory, as reflected in memoirs, diaries, personal correspondence, biographies, and autobiographies, all of which allow the reconstruction of the world of this first socialist. I also believe that Rakovsky's biography, on which I'm going to speak today, highlights neatly all these goals. But with him, I'm extending the chronology into the interwar period and highlight the move from the realm of utopia, of the future, to utopia on Earth. When in 1925 in Paris, arriving as the Soviet ambassador to France, Rakovsky was asked by a French journalist whether he was born to a Bulgarian family in Romania or to a Romanian one in Bulgaria. He answered, I quote, "7 cities are arguing to be the birthplace of Homer. I belong to at least 5 countries, Bulgaria, Romania, Russia, Ukraine, and France. But still, I'm sure I was born in a Bulgarian family in Kotel. Since then, I studied in Geneva and Nancy, I finished medicine in Montpellier, started law in Paris, and I have always mingled with Russian and French friends." These 5 countries owned him unwillingly for a while, and all disowned him. There are only 4 book-length biographies of Rakovsky, 2 French, 1 Bulgarian, and 1 Ukrainian. The early evidence on Rakovsky inevitably follows his own autobiography. He was born as Christio Georgiev Stanchev in Kotel, a small town in the Balkan Mountains in central Bulgaria, in 1873. Christian is the name he was known with abroad, so I will refer to him as Christian, but he is in fact Christio. The family was wealthy, with owning estates in the Dobruja, north of the Danube Delta, which was given to Romania by dint of a geopolitical caprice after 1878, when Bulgaria seceded from the Ottoman Empire. In order to preserve its income, the family relocated and became Romanian citizens. Christu was starstruck by his mother's side. His mother was the niece of the renowned revolutionary and literary figure Georgi Stoichkov Rakovsky, a major figure in the Bulgarian national pantheon. And Christus clearly saw himself as the embodiment in the incarnation of Rakovsky Sr., who was indeed the most cosmopolitan of the Bulgarian national figures of the 19th century. He had changed his own rather lackluster name of Popovich to Rakovsky, allegedly either using his father's village Rakovo or in honor of a Polish revolutionary, Michał Rakovsky. Christu likewise, at the age of 14, changed his name to Rakovsky with the agreement of his parents. He studied in Bulgarian schools, first in Kotel, Varna, and finally the high school in Gabrovo, where his teacher was Evtim Dabev, the first translator and publisher of Marxist literature. Christu shone with his forceful intellect, passionate temperament, and fiery oratorial skills. He was a born leader and organized reading groups, started a clandestine paper, and helped his teacher in the publication of Engels's The Development of Scientific Socialism. For this, he was expelled not only from the school, but without the right to enroll in any school in the Bulgarian principalities. He, therefore, began his studies in medicine in Geneva, together with his 2 likewise punished closest friends. In Geneva, he was involved in the student émigré circles and read mostly socialist rather than medical literature. There he met also his future wife, Liza Ryabova, a Russian student, who probably was the one who introduced him to Plekhanov, with whom he became very, very close, and to Vera Zasulich. He also became friends with Pavel Axelrod and Rosa Luxemburg. In 1893, he organized the Second International Congress of Socialist Students in Geneva and was a delegate to the Socialist Congress in Zurich, where he met Jules Gued, and to his end he became a passionate Guedist. The Geneva Circle, although relatively small and not long-lived, has a disproportionate influence in the early years of Bulgarian social democracy, not simply because of its closeness to Plekhanov, but also because of the personal talents of its members. They were young and also exceedingly self-assured, a little bit cocky, advocating the Russian example pronounced by Plekhanov, whereby émigrés from Switzerland would lead the Bulgarian socialist movement. This did not happen, of course, and they eventually joined the different wings of the Bulgarian Workers' Social Democratic Party, which was organized, and one of the earliest ones since 1891, and Rakovsky joined at that point the narrow faction and became its main foreign correspondent. In 1993, he transferred to Berlin, another country which also kicked him out. He became close to the father and son Liebknecht, to Wilhelm and to Karl, met August Bebel and Karl Kautsky, and became the Balkan correspondent for Vorwärts. At the end of 6 months, he was expelled from Germany. He returned to France, first to Nancy, and then 2 years in Montpellier, where in 1897 he and Lisa Ryabova graduated, and his doctoral thesis was The Cause of Crime and Degeneration. It was defended with huge accolades at the time. The end of his student years coincided with the eruption of the Armenian question, the Cretan Revolt, the struggle over Macedonia. And his series of articles on the Eastern question sealed his reputation as the specialist on the Eastern question in the Second International. He had to return to Romania in order to do his military service until 1900. Then he moved to St. Petersburg, where his wife was, of course, from, and he mixed with the so-called legal Marxists, Peter Struve, Mikhail Tugan-Baragovsky, and others. His stay in Russia was punctuated by 2 expulsions. In 1902, after the death in childbirth of his wife, which he experienced as really a huge blow, he worked as a physician in France, and he had big hopes to settle there and be naturalized, and even Clemenceau had written a recommendation for him, but he was denied naturalization because of his revolutionary activities. When he was summoned back to Romania, where he inherited his father's estate in 1904, he was already a well-known and well-respected figure in the Second International. Once in Romania, Rakovsky divided his time between overseeing the estate, practicing medicine, and active revolutionary work. When the Romanian Social Democratic Party, which had appeared in the 1990s, then was disbanded and was restored in 1910, he became the president of the party. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1905, he received notoriety with his successful intervention in the fate of the sailors of the battleship Potemkin, who had found refuge in the port of Constanța, and it was due to Rakovsky that he managed to persuade the Romanian government not to return them to Russia, to give them political asylum. Of course, it was the Great Peasant Revolt of 1907 in Romania, and its bloody quelling, which unleashed political repression not only against the peasant parties but also mostly against socialists. In the case of Rakovsky, there was an attempt to expel him from the country and revoke his Romanian citizenship. In the course of 5 years, until 1912, Rakovsky became a legal cause célèbre, and also the cause around which the class struggle in Romania was organized around his defense. Several times during this period, he entered the country to defend his claims and would be dramatically expelled as a persona non grata. Most of the time of his Romanian exile, he lived in Bulgaria and in Paris, and in 1909 he made attempts to receive Bulgarian citizenship, but he was refused. Although, of course, the Bulgarians resisted also Romanian pressure to expel him from the country, so he lived there but was denied citizenship. In 1910, he tried to play the role of arbiter in the Bulgarian socialist movement. He and Trotsky, who was his very close friend, were sent by the Second International to mend the split within the socialist ranks. Both he and Trotsky showed a dismissive attitude to the provincial socialists, and that, of course, won a vigorous response from Blagoev, the leader of the Bulgarian socialists, who said it is wrong to impose the unification of the proletariat everywhere following a template. Not knowing the concrete circumstances in which the working class movement develops in the separate countries. So when in 1912 the Romanian government restored his political rights, Rakovsky left Bulgaria for good. He never stepped into its territory again, although his links to his family and Bulgarian friends continued to be intensive. What followed were the war years, first the 2 Balkan Wars and then the Great War. Throughout, Rakovsky pleaded for peace. In 1915, he succeeded in organizing the Second Balkan Socialist Conference in Bucharest. Then he played an important role in organizing the first Zimmerwald conference in September 1915. And there he adopted a centrist position between the so-called right-wing majority, which wanted simply to issue a declaration for peace, and a left wing around Lenin calling for universal civil war. Rakovsky sided with a compromise manifesto drafted by Trotsky. This was later used by Zinoviev against Rakovsky in 1928. In 1917, Rakovsky was already in Stockholm, preparing for the third Zimmerwald conference. By then, he had already moved more to the left and had overcome some of his reservations which he had about Lenin's Blankism. By then, it was in Stockholm that he received the news of the October coup, and he joined the Bolsheviks and headed for Petrograd. There he met Lenin by his own invitation. Lenin had previously criticized Rakovsky, but his position changed, and it is the niece of Rakovsky who was present at the meeting who is explaining. Lenin, she says, knew well how to use all talented people, and at this moment of developments on the southern front with Romania, he thought that Rakovsky would be the best figure since he was extremely popular with the Romanian workers. From then on, the 44-year-old Rakovsky was no longer the dedicated and fiery activist dreaming of a future utopia. He had become a fiery activist, building it here. He was immediately promoted to the highest positions in the Bolshevik hierarchy: member of the Central Executive Committee of the Russian Socialist Republic, Presidium member, member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, of the Russian Communist Party. 1919, he is one of the co-founders of the Comintern. After the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Rakovsky was nominated by Lenin to be the head of the Ukrainian provisional government in Kharkiv. He was, according to Trotsky, the soul and the true chief of Ukraine. Rakovsky turned out to be a good and disciplined administrator, but in this clash with practice, he inevitably soiled his hands. His first attempts to create large agricultural farms were unsuccessful. He was even criticized by Lenin, who asked him to divide up the land and gain the trust of the peasantry. He had become the virtual head of the Red Army in the bloody civil war in Ukraine with the armies of Denikin, Petlura, Wrangel, Makhno, and he was responsible, in fact, for the Red Terror. And while Trotsky explained his failures with his intellectual softness, the great writer Vladimir Korolenko, who had previously been close to him, did not spare his criticism. The latest, I mentioned the latest Ukrainian biography of 2014 shows understanding for the extreme circumstances in which he had to function, but holds him personally responsible for the Red Terror and hostage-taking while acknowledging his personal decency. His maturing under the pressure of reality is most obvious in his evolution on the national question, which led to his conflict with Stalin and his removal from the Ukraine. Rakovsky came in with the ready-made and rather naive formulas about the difference between bourgeois and socialist nations due to their different economic base. Once private property, according to him, and competition were eliminated, the frontiers between socialist states ceased to have a political character and become simply administrative limits. He was at first not aware of great Russian chauvinism and claimed that the danger of Russification is entirely without foundation. He soon saw the incongruity of these views and he slowed the pace of collectivization, passed the series of laws which revived the small and middling peasantry, and of course the NEP, the new economic policy, brought in some economic recovery. His greatest success, however, was the compromise with the Borodists, the chief and powerful rival of the Bolsheviks, a left-wing nationalist party with enormous influence over the peasantry. While there was no difference in the ideological devotion of the different groups to the communist cause, the issue of Ukrainian sovereignty played itself out in the relations to Moscow. Rakovsky's evolution is telling. From an initial hard centrist to a dedicated federalist. By 1921, he demanded a substantial degree of real independence. He wanted control of foreign trade so that commercial treaties with Russia would not apply to Ukraine. He advocated complete control of education, healthcare, the agrarian sector, more rights on financial issues, especially credits, more rights in foreign relations, ceding completely only military affairs to the center. In April 1923 was the first, the 12th Congress, in the first one in which Lenin was absent. The dispute came into the open and ended with the defeat of Rakovsky and the triumph of Stalin's line of centralized union. By then, Stalin had already moved to on the road of socialism in one country, although, of course, it was not yet formulated as a policy. This became only in 1925 in a brochure by Bukharin. On the other hand, Rakovsky and Trotsky approached the issue in view of international repercussions. For Rakovsky, the national question was linked to the victory of the world revolution, the permanent revolution. He envisaged the spread of revolution from Ukraine through the Balkans into Europe. The illusions for a permanent revolution, of course, were still ripe at this moment because this was before the bloody demise of the September Revolution in Bulgaria and the less bloody but still a definitive end in Germany in November of 1923. In view of this, he advocated, and that's actually interesting, that for purposes of trade and commerce, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Austria should be demarcated as zones of influence for the Ukraine and respected as such by the Russians. But Rakovsky was also concerned about the demeaning effects on the international movement by this double standard. And this is what he said. If we are to become the center of the struggle of the oppressed nationalities outside the boundaries of the USSR, we must internally make a correct decision on the national question. Because if we are going to speak outside about national self-determination and not practice it inside, we would be accused of hypocrisy. Rakovsky had evolved from a hard centrist, as I said, who dogmatically had denied the existence of a national question, to a federalist who, at the same time, never advocated complete decentralization and loose union. Rakovsky was removed from the Ukraine and sent as ambassador to London and later Paris. The next 4 years can be deemed one of his most successful ones, but he experienced them as exile. He was very unhappy about that. When he returned to Moscow in 1927, Trotsky was already expelled from the Politburo and from the party, and the 15th Congress in 1927, Rakovsky himself, together with the 75 members of the United Opposition, were expelled, and he was exiled in Astrakhan as a minor official. Rakovsky was a man of action, but he was forced to a contemplative posture during the years of his exile and produced a number of interesting analyses. Among them, I will mention one which is really crucial and very little attention is paid to it, the so-called Letter to Comrade Valentinov from 1928, in which he analyzed the professional dangers of power. Whereas for Trotsky, the bureaucratic degeneration of the USSR was attributed to Russian backwardness, the numerical weakness of the working class, and the isolation and capital encirclement, for Rakovsky it was a structural problem having to do with any power. He was not speaking merely for the working class, but referring to the inherent difficulties of any new directing class, including the bourgeoisie. He saw little room for the opposition caught between a tyrannical bureaucracy and apathetic working class. In the word of Isaac Deutscher, a conclusion of this kind spells the death sentence for any political movement. Rakovsky viewed the course of the revolution and the opposition's prospects with cool, profound insight and stoical equanimity. From Astrakhan, Rakovsky was moved to Barnaul, and after a kind of quasi-rehabilitation in 1934, was rearrested in 1937, and in 1938 was sentenced in the trial of the 21, alongside Bukharin, Rykov, Kristinsky, and others. Rakovsky received a 20-year prison sentence that he spent in Oriol prison, where he was shot on the 11th of September, 1941, together with Trotsky's sister and widow of Kamenev, Olga Kameneva, Maria Spiridonova, Dmitry Pletnyov, and 157 other political prisoners a month before the Germans occupied Oriol. From the late 1920s on, Rakovsky had disappeared from the Soviet encyclopedias and the history of the Communist Party, as well as from the official textbooks in the satellite countries after the Second World War for more than 60 years. His name was kept alive among the opposition abroad, and there is no one who had not cited his portrayal by Trotsky in My Life. And just a brief quote from that. Rakovsky is internationally one of the best known figures in the European socialist movement. A Bulgarian by birth, he speaks all the Balkan and 4 European languages. He has at various times played an active part in the inner workings of 4 socialist parties, Bulgarian, Russian, French, and Romanian. Rakovsky's personal traits, his broad international outlook, his profound nobility of character have made him particularly odious to Stalin, who personifies the exact opposite of these qualities. Now, Trotsky was keen to use this parallel, and he would say that a Plutarch of the Soviet Revolution would hardly have found 2 other figures that would better illustrate each other with the contrast of their characters than Stalin and Rakovsky. And he insisted on a figure of speech which he repeated several times, that in Rakovsky he saw an authentic Europeanness. This trope of Europeanness is the main one which is present in the latest and most updated of Rakovsky's biographies, the mentioned co-authored book by 3 Ukrainian scholars, which came out in 2014, whose very subtitle puts forward the leitmotif: Europeanism and Bolshevism, the unfinished duel. It is without any doubt a valuable achievement, bringing for the first time important information from Russian and Ukrainian archives, gathering and systematizing and synthesizing the enormous literature which has been spread all around in several languages and obscure and not obscure editions. But if I stress the leitmotif, it is in no way to diminish the value of this book, but to emphasize the present zeitgeist. The book begins with the reminiscences of one of the author's mother, a medical student in the 1920s, who was sent from her lab to draw blood from party leaders and their families. And visiting Rakovsky's home, she was struck that everything there was European. When asked later what European meant for her, she would say, dignity combined with simplicity. Of course, there are Bolsheviks with such qualities, and there are also European Bolsheviks, and not to speak of Bolshevik Europeans, as well as European Stalinists, Stalinist Europeans, and anti-Stalinists. But this binarism has been typical for the East of Europe. Europe serving as role model of civilized behavior, economic progress, and high culture. It has been present since the 19th century, but it was especially poignant during the Cold War, culminating with the return to Europe. It seems that only after the accession to the European Union is there a more realistic understanding of Europe. And I don't mean Euroscepticism, but simply a sober assessment devoid of idealization. This, of course, is not the case in Ukraine, where Europe is still the unattainable goal. Rakovsky is depicted as a tragic figure by these authors, crucified between Moscow and the West, a centrist who never became a consistent Leninist, a figure alien to the milieu of political marginals, the Bolshevik nouveau riche, and who treated him with hidden animosity. Like all of Rakovsky's biographers, the authors are influenced by Trotsky's positive characterization, which they copiously cite, but there is a whiff which is pretty unconvincing when they disengage Rakovsky from Trotsky's legacy, when they maintain that he did not share Trotsky's views of a permanent revolution. He was actually one of his main locomotives. Pierre Brouet, one of the French biographers, also uses this European trope, citing Trotsky, but he conveniently left out the phrase that preceded Trotsky's verdict, and the phrase is the following, Trotsky. Rakovsky organically rose from the primitiveness of the Balkan backwater to the world horizon. Rakovsky, as I already showed, had risen to the Marxist world horizons already in the primitive backwater of Bulgaria. Francis Comte, the pioneer of Rakovsky's biographers, this was his dissertation, gave a strange explanation in the same vein. Rakovsky's tragic fate probably lies in the fact this is classical education, ranging over most European countries, provided him with few defenses in a system increasingly run by primitive brutality under the effect of Stalin. One wonders what kind of defenses one should have against the civilized brutality of classically educated Europeans. Philip Panayotov, the Bulgarian biographer, was the only one who was not afflicted by Europeanosis, and his main melancholic message was the curse of Utopia. Rakovsky has been disowned by all 5 countries who had laid claim to. His claims were half-hearted and made in jest, but the disowning was most earnest. He has been jostled from one country to another, both in life and in death. Brouet has suggested 2 reasons for this. The one is Stalinism, the other is anti-communism, nationalism, and narrowness of mind. With the rehabilitation under Khrushchev, which came 3 decades after the death of Stalin, the first of this, anti-Stalinism, has abated, although there are some die-hard Stalinists, chiefly in Russia, but they too are on the wane. The late rehabilitation can be explained chiefly by the fact that the legacy of Trotsky continues to be ambivalent while being assessed both in Russia and abroad. But nationalism and anti-communism are well and alive everywhere, including officially in Putin's Russia. Luckily for Rakovsky, precisely because he was taboo during the Soviet period, there are no monuments to him in the Ukraine. In Romania and Bulgaria, anti-communism is the dominant melody, although for some of the Bulgarian left, at least, Rakovsky can still seem a proud symbol, a European. Less so in Romania, where the dominant narrative is that the left was the product of foreign elements, chiefly Jews and Bulgarians. In France, Rakovsky was tenderly adopted by Comte and Brouet. Brouet himself was a prominent Trotskyist. And in fact, in scholarship, France was the first who paid him serious attention. Rakovsky and Trotsky's friend Adolf Joffe wrote in his suicide letter in November 1927, "Human life is meaningful only in the service of infinity, and for us infinity is humankind." It is perhaps most natural to frame Rakovsky as an internationalist and cosmopolitan. He would surely not decline the honor, except that these 2 terms have had their dubious history, and who uses them to frame what, where, and when leaves a contradictory stamp. Rakovsky is a particle that has to be allowed to float briefly and, orbiting the earth full of hope, waiting for the world revolution. Who knows, maybe it will come. So I will finish with the way I finished my book and quote St. Paul in his epistle to the Romans, the Bible finally. "Hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we don't see, we eagerly wait for its perseverance." Thank you.